Chapter 59. Esther's Narrative. It was 3 o'clock in the morning when the houses outside London did at last begin to exclude the country, and to close us in with streets. We had made our way along roads in a far worse condition than when we had traversed them by daylight, both the fall and the thaw having lasted ever since. But the energy of my companion never slackened. It had only been, as I thought, of less assistance than the horses in getting us on, and it had often aided them. They had stopped exhausted halfway up hills, they had been driven through streams of turbulent water, they had slipped down and become entangled with the harness, but he and his little lantern had been always ready, and when the mishap was set right, I had never heard any variation of his cool "Get on, my lads." The steadiness and confidence with which he had directed our journey back I could not account for. Never wavering, he never even stopped to make an inquiry until we were within a few miles of London. A very few words here and there were then enough for him, and thus we came, between 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning, into Islington. I will not dwell upon the suspense and anxiety with which I reflected all this time that we were leaving my mother farther and farther behind every minute. I think I had some strong hope that he must be right, and could not fail to have a satisfactory object in following this woman. But I tormented myself with questioning it, and discussing it during the whole journey. What was to ensue when we found her, and what could compensate us for this loss of time, were questions also that I could not possibly dismiss. My mind was quite tortured by long dwelling on such reflections when we stopped. We stopped in a high street where there was a coach stand. My companion paid our two drivers, who were as completely covered with splashes as if they had been dragged along the roads like the carriage itself, and giving them some brief direction where to take it, lifted me out of it and into a hackney coach he had chosen from the rest. "Why, my dear," he said as he did this, "how wet you are!" I had not been conscious of it, but the melted snow had found its way into the carriage, and I had got out 2 or 3 times when a fallen horse was plunging and had to be got up, and the wet had penetrated my dress. I assured him it was no matter, but the driver, who knew him, would not be dissuaded by me from running down the street to his stable, whence he brought an armful of clean dry straw. They shook it out and strewed it well about me, and I found it warm and comfortable. "Now, my dear," said Mr. Bucket, with his head in at the window after I was shut up, "we are going to mark this person down. It may take a little time, but you don't mind that. You're pretty sure that I've got a motive, ain't you?" I little thought what it was, I little thought how in shorter time I should understand it better, but I assured him that I had confidence in him. "So you may have, my dear," he returned, "and I'll tell you what, if you only repose half as much confidence in me as I repose in you after what I've experienced of you, that'll do. Lord, you're no trouble at all. I never see a young woman in any station of society, and I've seen many elevated ones too, conduct herself like you have conducted yourself since you were called out of your bed. You're a pattern, you know, that's what you are," said Mr. Bucket warmly. "You're a pattern." I told him I was very glad, as indeed I was, to have been no hindrance to him, and that I hoped I should be none now. "My dear," he returned, "when a young lady is as mild as she's game, and as game as she's mild, that's all I ask, and more than I expect. She then becomes a queen. That's about what you are yourself." With these encouraging words, they really were encouraging to me under those lonely and anxious circumstances, he got upon the box, and we once more drove away. As we drove, I neither knew then or have ever known since, but we appeared to seek out the narrowest and the worst streets in London. Whenever I saw him directing the driver, I was prepared for our descending into a deeper complication of such streets, and we never failed to do so. Sometimes we emerged upon a wider thoroughfare, or came to a larger building than the generality, well lighted. Then we stopped at offices like those we had visited when we began our journey, and I saw him in consultation with others. Sometimes he would get down by an archway or at a street corner, and mysteriously show the light of his little lantern. This would attract similar lights from various dark quarters, like so many insects, and a fresh consultation would be held. By degrees we appeared to contract our search within narrower and easier limits. Single police officers on duty could now tell Mr. Bucket what he wanted to know, and point to him where to go. At last we stopped for a rather long conversation between him and one of these men, which I supposed to be satisfactory from his manner of nodding from time to time. When it was finished he came to me, looking very busy, very attentive. "Now, Miss Summerson," he said to me, "you won't be alarmed whatever comes off, I know. It is not necessary for me to give you any further caution than to tell you that we have marked this person down, and that you may be of use to me before I know it myself. I don't like to ask such a thing, my dear, but would you walk a little way?" Of course I got out directly and took his arm. "It ain't so easy to keep your feet," said Mr. Bucket, "but take time." Although I looked about me confusedly and hurriedly as we crossed the street, I thought I knew the place. "Are we in Holborn?" I asked him. "Yes," said Mr. Bucket. "Do you know this turning?" "It looks like Chancery Lane." "And was christened so, my dear," said Mr. Bucket. We turned down it, and as we went shuffling through the sleet, I heard the clock strike 5:30. We passed on in silence, and as quickly as we could with such a foothold, when someone, coming towards us on the narrow pavement, wrapped in a cloak, stopped and stood aside to give me room. In the same moment I heard an exclamation of wonder, and my own name, from Mr. Woodcourt. I knew his voice very well. It was so unexpected and so, I don't know what to call it, whether pleasant or painful, to come upon it after my feverish wandering journey, and in the midst of the night, that I could not keep back the tears from my eyes. It was like hearing his voice in a strange country. "My dear Miss Summerson, that you should be out at this hour in such weather!" He had heard from my guardian of my having been called away on some uncommon business, and he said so to dispense with any explanation. I told him that we had just but left a coach and were going, but then I was obliged to look at my companion. "Well, you see, Mr. Woodcourt," he had caught the name from me, "we are going at present into the next street. Inspector Bucket." Mr. Woodcourt, disregarding my remonstrances, had hurriedly taken off his cloak and was putting it about me. "That's a good move too," said Mr. Bucket, assisting. "Very good move." "May I go with you?" said Mr. Woodcourt. I don't know whether to me or to my companion. "Why, Lord!" exclaimed Mr. Bucket, taking the answer on himself. "Of course you may." It was all said in a moment, and they took me between them, wrapped in the cloak. "I have just left Richard," said Mr. Woodcourt. "I have been sitting with him since 10 o'clock last night." "Oh, dear me! Is he ill?" "No, no, believe me, not ill, but not quite well. He was depressed and faint. You know he gets so worried and so worn sometimes. And Ada sent to me, of course, and when I came home I found her note and came straight here. Well, Richard revived so much after a little while, and Ada was so happy and so convinced of it being my doing, though God knows I had little enough to do with it, that I remained with him until he'd been fast asleep for some hours. As fast asleep as she is now, I hope." His friendly and familiar way of speaking of them, his unaffected devotion to them, the grateful confidence with which I knew he had inspired my darling, and the comfort he was to her, could I separate all this from his promise to me? How thankless I must have been if I had not recalled the words he said to me when he was so moved by the change in my appearance. "I will accept him as a trust, and it shall be a sacred one." We now turned into another narrow street. "Mr. Woodcourt," said Mr. Bucket, who had eyed him closely as we came along, "our business takes us to a law stationer's here, a certain Mr. Snagsby's. What, you know him, do you?" He was so quick that he saw it in an instant. "Yes, I know a little of him, and I have called upon him at his place." "Indeed, sir," said Mr. Bucket. "Then you will be so good as to let me leave Miss Summerson with you for a moment, while I go and have half a word with him." The last police officer with whom he had conferred was standing silently behind us. I was not aware of it until he struck in on me, saying, "I heard some one crying." "Don't be alarmed, miss," he returned. "It's Snagsby's servant." "Well, you see," said Mr. Bucket, "the girl's a subject to fits, and has 'em bad upon her to night. A most contrary circumstance it is, for I want certain information out of that girl, and she must be brought to reason somehow." "At all events, they wouldn't be up yet if it wasn't for her, Mr. Bucket," said the other man. "She's been at it pretty well all night, sir." "Well, that's true," he returned. "My light's burnt out. Show yours a moment." All this passed in a whisper, a door or two from the house, in which I could faintly hear crying and moaning. In the little round of light produced for the purpose, Mr. Bucket went up to the door and knocked. The door was opened after he had knocked twice, and went in, leaving us standing in the street. "Miss Summerson," said Mr. Woodcourt, "if, without obtruding myself on your confidence, I may remain near you, pray let me do so." "You are truly kind," I answered. "I need wish to keep no secret of my own from you. If I keep any, it's another's." "I quite understand. Trust me. I will remain near you only so long as I can fully respect it." "I trust implicitly to you," I said. "I know and deeply feel how sacredly you keep your promise." After a short time the little round of light shone out again, and Mr. Bucket advanced towards us in it with his earnest face. "Please come in, Miss Summerson," he said, "and sit down by the fire. Mr. Woodcourt, from information I have received, I understand you are a medical man. Would you look to this girl and see if anything can be done to bring her round? She has a letter somewhere that I particularly want. It's not in her box, and I think it must be about her, but she is so twisted and clenched up that she is difficult to handle without hurting." We all three went into the house together. Although it was cold and raw, it smelt close too for being up all night. In the passage behind the door stood a scared, sorrowful-looking little man in a grey coat, who seemed to have a naturally polite manner, and spoke meekly. "Downstairs, if you please, Mr. Bucket," said he. "The lady will excuse the front kitchen. We use it as our work-a-day sitting-room. The back is Guster's bedroom, and in it she's a carrying on, poor thing, of frightful extent." We went downstairs, followed by Mr. Snagsby, who, as I soon found the little man to be. In the front kitchen, sitting by the fire, was Mrs. Snagsby, with very red eyes and a very severe expression of face. "My little woman," said Mr. Snagsby, entering behind us, "to waive, not to put too fine a point upon it, my dear, hostilities for one single moment in the course of this prolonged night, here is Inspector Bucket, Mr. Woodcourt, and a lady." She looked very much astonished, as if she had reason for doing, and looked particularly hard at me. "My little woman," said Mr. Snagsby, sitting down in the remotest corner by the door, as if he were taking a liberty. "It is not unlikely that you may inquire of me why Inspector Bucket, Mr. Woodcourt, and the lady call upon us in Cook's Court, Cursitor Street, at this present hour. I don't know. I have not the least idea. If I was to be informed, I should despair of understanding, and I'd rather not be told." He appeared so miserable, sitting with his head upon his hand, and I appeared so unwelcome, that I was going to offer an apology, when Mr. Bucket took the matter on himself. "The best thing you can do is to go along with Mr. Woodcourt to look after your Guster." "My Guster, Mr. Bucket," said Mr. Snagsby. "Go on, sir, go on. I shall be charged with that next." "And to hold the candle," pursued Mr. Bucket, without correcting himself, "or hold her, or to make yourself useful in any way that you're asked, which there's not a man alive more ready to do, for you're a man of urbanity and suavity, you know, and you've got the sort of heart that can feel for another. Mr. Woodcourt, would you be so good as to see to her, and if you could get that letter from her, let me have it as soon as you ever can." As they went out, Mr. Bucket made me sit down in a corner by the fire, and take off my wet shoes, which he turned up to dry upon the fender, talking all the time. "Don't you be at all put out, miss, by the want of a hospitable look from Mrs. Snagsby there, because she's under a mistake altogether. She'll find that out sooner than will be agreeable to a lady of her generally correct manner of forming her thoughts, because I'm a going to explain it to her." Here, standing on the hearth, with his wet hat and shawls in his hand, himself a pile of wet, he turned to Mrs. Snagsby. "Now, the first thing that I say to you, as a married woman, possessing what you might call charms, you know, believe me, if all those endearing, and cetera, you're well acquainted with the song, because it's in vain for you to tell me that you and good society are strangers. Charms, attractions, mind you, that ought to give you confidence in yourself is, that you've done it." Mrs. Snagsby looked rather alarmed. relented a little and faltered. What did Mr. Bucket mean? What does Mr. Bucket mean? He repeated, and I saw by his face that all the time he talked he was listening for the discovery of the letter. To my own great agitation, for I knew then how important it must be. I'll tell you what it means, ma'am. Go and see Othello acted. There's the tragedy for you. Mrs. Snagsby consciously asked why. Why, said Mr. Bucket. Because you'll come to that if you don't look out. Why, at the very moment while I speak, I know what your mind's not wholly free from respecting this young lady. But shall I tell you who this young lady is? Now come, you're what I call an intellectual woman, with your soul too large for your body. If you come to that, and chafing it, and you know me, and you recollect where you saw me last, and what was talked of in that circle, don't you? Yes, very well. This young lady is that young lady. Mrs. Snagsby appeared to understand the reference better than I did at the time. And Tuffy, as you call him, Joe, was mixed up in the same business, and no other. And the law writer that you know of was mixed up in the same business, and no other. And your husband, with no more knowledge of it than your great-grandfather, was mixed up, by Mr. Tulkinghorn deceased, his best customer, in the same business, and no other. And the whole biling of people was mixed up in the same business, and no other. Yet a married woman, possessing your attractions, shuts her eyes, and sparklers too, and goes and runs her delicate formed head against a wall. Why, I'm ashamed of you. I expected Mr. Woodcourt might have got it by this time. Mrs. Snagsby shook her head and put her handkerchief to her eyes. Is that all? Said Mr. Bucket excitedly. No, see what happens. Another person mixed up in that business, and no other. A person in a wretched state comes here tonight, and is seen as speaking to your maidservant. And between her and your maidservant there passes a paper that I would give £100 for, down. What do? You hide and you watch 'em, and you pounce upon that maidservant, knowing what she's subject to, and what a little thing will bring them on, and in that surprising manner, with that severity, that by the Lord she goes off and keeps off when a life might be hanging upon that girl's words. He so thoroughly meant what he said, now that I had voluntarily clasped my hands, and felt the room turning away from me. But it stopped. Mr. Woodcourt came in, put a paper in his hand, and went away again. Now, Mrs. Snagsby, the only amends you can make, said Mr. Bucket, rapidly glancing at it, is to let me speak a word to this young lady in private here. And if you know of any help that you can give to that gentleman in the next kitchen there, or can think of any one thing that's likelier than another to bring the girl round, do your swiftest and best. In an instant she was gone, and he had shut the door. Now, my dear, you're quite steady and quite sure of yourself? Quite, said I. Whose writing is that? It was my mother's, a pencil writing on a crushed and torn piece of paper, blotted with wet, folded roughly like a letter, and directed to me at my guardian's. You know the hand, he said, and if you're firm enough to read it to me, do, but be particular to a word. It had been written in portions at different times. I read what follows. I came to the cottage with two objects. First, to see the dear one, if I could, once more, but only to see her, not to speak to her, or let her know that I was near. The other object, to elude pursuit and be lost. Do not blame the mother for her share. The assistance that she rendered me, she rendered on my strongest assurance that it was for the dear one's good. You remember her dead child? The men's consent I bought, but her help was freely given. I came, that was written, said my companion, when she rested there. It bears out what I made of it. I was right. The next was written at another time. I have wandered a long distance, and for many hours, and I know that I must soon die. These streets, I have no purpose but to die. When I left I had a worse, but I am saved from adding that guilt to the rest. Cold, wet, and fatigue are sufficient causes for my being found dead. But I shall die of others, though I suffer from these. It was right that all that had sustained me should give way at once, and that I should die of terror and my conscience. Take courage, said Mr. Bucket. There's only a few words more. These two were written at another time. to all appearance almost in the dark. I have done all I could do to be lost. I shall soon be forgotten and shall disgrace him least. I have nothing about me by which I can be recognized. This paper I part with now. The place where I shall lie down, if I can get so far, has been often in my mind. Farewell. Forgive. Mr. Bucket, supporting me with his arm, lowered me gently into my chair. Cheer up. Don't think me hard with you, my dear, but as soon as ever you feel equal to it, get your shoes on and be ready. I did as he required, but I was left there a long time, praying for my unhappy mother. They were all occupied with the poor girl, and I heard Mr. Woodcourt directing them and speaking to her often. At length he came in with Mr. Bucket and said that it was as important to address her gently he thought it best that I should ask her for whatever information we desired to obtain. There was no doubt that she could now reply to questions if she was soothed and not alarmed. Questions, Mr. Bucket said, were how she came by the letter, what passed between her and the person who gave her the letter, and where the person went. Holding my mind as steadily as I could to these points, I went into the next room with them. Mr. Woodcourt would have remained outside, but at my solicitation went in with us. The poor girl was sitting on the floor where they had laid her down. They stood around her, though at a little distance, that she might have air. She was not pretty, and looked weak and poor, but she had a plaintive and good face, though it was still a little wild. I kneeled on the ground beside her, and put her poor head upon my shoulder, whereupon she drew her arm around my neck and burst into tears. "My poor girl," said I, laying my face against her forehead, for indeed I was crying too, and trembling. "It seems cruel to trouble you now, but more depends on our knowing something about this letter than I could tell you in an hour." She began piteously declaring that she didn't mean any harm. She didn't mean any harm, Mrs. Snagsby. "We are all sure of that," said I, "but pray tell me how you got it." "Yes, dear lady, I will, and tell you true. I'll tell you true. Indeed, Mrs. Snagsby, I'm sure of that," said I. "And how was it?" "I'd been out on an errand, dear lady, long after it was dark, quite late, and when I came home I found a common-looking person, all wet and muddy, looking up at our house. When she saw me coming in at the door, she called me back and said did I live here, and I said yes, and she said she knew only one or two places about here, but had lost her way and couldn't find them. Oh, what shall I do, or what shall I do? They won't believe me. She didn't say any harm to me, and I didn't say any harm to her. Indeed, Mrs. Snagsby, it was necessary for her mistress to comfort her, which she did, I must say, with a good deal of contrition, before she could be got beyond this." "She could not find those places?" said I. "No," cried the girl, shaking her head. "No, couldn't find them. And she was so faint and lame and miserable, oh, so wretched, that if you'd seen her, Mr. Snagsby, you'd have given her half a crown, I know." "Well, Guster, my girl," said he, at first not knowing what to say, "I hope I should." "And yet she was so well spoken," said the girl, looking at me with wide open eyes, "that it made a person's heart bleed. And so she said to me, did I know the way to the burying ground? And I asked her which burying ground, and she said the poor burying ground. And so I told her I had been a poor child myself, and it was according to parishes. But she said she meant a poor burying ground not very far from here, where there was an archway and a step and an iron gate." As I watched her face and soothed her to go on, I saw that Mr. Bucket received this with a look which I could not separate from one of alarm. "Oh dear, dear," cried the girl, pressing her hair back with her hands. "What shall I do? What shall I do? She meant the burying ground where the man was buried that took the sleeping stuff, that you came home and told us of, Mr. Snagsby. That frightened me so, Mrs. Snagsby. Oh, I'm frightened again. Hold me." "You're so much better now," said I. "Pray tell me more." "Yes, I will. Yes, I will. But don't be angry with me. There's a dear lady, because I have been so ill." Angry with her, poor soul. "There, now I will, now I will." So she said I could tell her how to find it, and I said yes, and I told her, and she looked at me with eyes like almost as if she was blind, and herself all waving back. And so she took out the letter and showed it me. It said if she was to put that in the post office, it would be rubbed out and not minded and never sent. Would I take it from her and send it, and the messenger would be paid at the house? And so I said yes, if it was no harm, and she said no, no harm. So I took it from her, and she said she had nothing to give me, and I said I was poor myself, and consequently wanted nothing. And so she said, God bless you, and went. And did she go? Yes, cried the girl, anticipating the inquiry. Yes, she went the way I had shown her. And I came in, and Mrs. Snagsby came behind me from somewhere, and laid hold of me, and I was frightened. Mr. Woodcourt took her kindly from me. Mr. Bucket wrapped me up, and immediately we were in the street. Mr. Woodcourt hesitated, but I said, Don't leave me now. And Mr. Bucket added, You'll be better with us. We may want you. Don't lose time. I have the most confused impressions of that walk. I recollect that it was neither night nor day, that morning was dawning, but the street lamps were not yet put out, that the sleet was still falling, and that all the ways were deep with it. I recollect a few chilled people passing in the streets. I recollect the wet housetops, the clogged and bursting gutters and waterspouts, the mounds of blackened ice and snow over which we passed, the narrowness of the courts by which we went. At the same time, I remember that poor girl seemed to be telling her story audibly and plainly in my hearing, that I could feel her resting on my arm, that the stained house fronts put on human shapes and looked at me, that great water gates seemed to be opening and closing in my head or in the air, and that the unreal things were more substantial than the real. At last we stood under a dark and miserable covered way, where one lamp was burning over an iron gate, and where the morning faintly struggled in. The gate was closed. Behind it was a burial ground, a dreadful spot in which the night was very slowly stirring, but where I could dimly see heaps of dishonoured graves and stones, hemmed in by filthy houses with a few dull lights in their windows, and on whose walls a thick humidity broke out like a disease. On the step at the gate, drenched in the fearful wet of such a place, which oozed and splashed down everywhere, I saw, with a cry of pity and horror, a woman lying, Jenny, the mother of the dead child. I ran forward, but they stopped me, and Mr. Woodcourt entreated me with the greatest earnestness, even with tears, before I went up to the figure to listen for an instant to what Mr. Bucket said. I did so, as I thought I did so, I am sure. Miss Summerson, you'll understand me if you think a moment. They changed clothes at the cottage. They changed clothes at the cottage. I could repeat the words in my mind, and I knew what they meant of themselves, but I attached no meaning to them in any other connection. And one returned, said Mr. Bucket, and one went on, and the one that went on only went on a certain way agreed upon to deceive, and then turned across country and went home. Think a moment. I could repeat this in my mind too, but I had not the least idea what it meant. I saw before me, lying on the step, the mother of the dead child. She lay there with one arm creeping round a bar of the iron gate, and seeming to embrace it. She lay there who had so lately spoken to my mother. She lay there, a distressed, unsheltered, senseless creature. She who had brought my mother's letter, who could give me the only clue to where my mother was. She who was to guide us to rescue and save her, whom we had sought so far, who had come to this condition by some means connected with my mother that I could not follow, and might be passing beyond our reach and help at that moment. She lay there, and they stopped me. I saw, but I did not comprehend, the solemn and compassionate look in Mr. Woodcourt's face. I saw, but did not comprehend his touching the other on the breast to keep him back. I saw him stand uncovered in the bitter air, with a reverence for something, but my understanding for all this was gone. I even heard it said between them, Shall she go? She had better go. Her hand should be the first to touch her. They have a higher right than ours. I passed on to the gate and stooped down. I lifted the heavy head, put the long dark hair aside, and turned the face. And it was my mother, cold and dead. Chapter 60. Perspective. I proceed to other passages of my narrative. From the goodness of all about me I derive such consolation as I can never think of unmoved. I have already said so much of myself, and so much still remains, that I will not dwell upon my sorrow. I had an illness, but it was not a long one, and I would avoid even this mention of it if I could quite keep down the recollection of their sympathy. I proceed to other passages of my narrative. During the time of my illness we were still in London, where Mrs. Woodcourt had come on my guardian's invitation to stay with us. When my guardian thought me well and cheerful enough to talk with him in our old way, though I could have done that sooner if he would have believed me, I resumed my work in my chair beside his. He had appointed the time himself, and we were alone. "Dame Trot," said he, receiving me with a kiss, "welcome to the growlery again, my dear. I have a scheme to develop. The little woman, I propose to remain here, perhaps for 6 months, perhaps for a longer time, as it may be. Quite to settle here for a while, in short." "And in the meanwhile leave Bleak House," said I. "Ay, my dear, Bleak House," he returned, "must learn to take care of itself." I thought his tone sounded sorrowful, but looking at him I saw his kind face lighted up by its pleasantest smile. "Bleak House," he repeated, and his tone did not sound sorrowful, I found. "Must learn to take care of itself. It's a long way from Ada, my dear, and Ada stands so much in need of you." "It's like you, guardian," said I, "to have been taking that into consideration for a happy surprise to both of us." "Not so disinterested either, my dear, if you mean to extol me for that virtue. Since you were generally on the road, you could be seldom with me. And besides, I wish to hear as much and as often of Ada as I can in this condition of estrangement from poor Rick. Not of her alone, but of him too, poor fellow. Have you seen Mr. Woodcourt this morning, guardian?" "I see Mr. Woodcourt every morning, Dame Durden." "Does he still say the same of Richard?" "Just the same. He knows of no direct bodily illness that he has. On the contrary, he believes he has none. Yet he is not easy about him. Who can be?" My dear girl had been to see us lately every day, sometimes twice in a day, but we had foreseen all along that this would only last until I was quite myself. We knew full well that her fervent heart was as full of affection and gratitude towards her cousin John as it had ever been, and we acquitted Richard of laying any injunctions upon her to stay away. But we knew, on the other hand, that she felt it part of her duty to him to be sparing of her visits at our house. My guardian's delicacy had soon perceived this, and had tried to convey to her that he thought she was right. "Dear, unfortunate, mistaken Richard," said I, "when will he awake from his delusion?" "He is not in the way to do so now, my dear," replied my guardian. "The more he suffers, the more averse he will be to me, having made me the principal representative of the great occasion of his suffering." I could not help adding, "so unreasonably." "Ah, Dame Trot, Dame Trot," returned my guardian, "what shall we find reasonable in Jarndyce and Jarndyce? Unreason and injustice at the top, unreason and injustice at the heart, and at the bottom unreason and injustice from beginning to end. If it ever has an end, how shall poor Rick, always hovering near it, pluck reason out of it? He no more gathers grapes from thorns or figs from thistles than older men did in old times." His gentleness and consideration for Richard, whenever we spoke of him, touched me, so that I was always silent on this subject very soon. I suppose the Lord Chancellor and the Vice Chancellors and the whole Chancery battery of great guns would be infinitely astonished by such an unreasoned injustice in one of their suitors, pursued my guardian. "When these learned gentlemen begin to raise moss rose from the powder they sow in their wigs, I shall begin to be astonished too." He checked himself in glancing towards the window to look where the wind was, and leaned on the back of my chair instead. "Well, well, little woman, to go on, my dear. The rock we must leave time to time, chance, and hopeful circumstance. We must not shipwreck Ada upon it. She cannot afford, and he cannot afford, the remotest chance of another separation from a friend. Therefore I have particularly begged of Woodcourt, and I now particularly beg of you, my dear, not to move this subject with Rick. Let it rest. Next week, next month, next year, sooner or later, he will see me with clearer eyes. I can wait." But I had already discussed it with him, I confessed, and so I thought had Mr. Woodcourt. "So he tells me," returned my guardian. "Very good. He has made his protest, and Dame Durden has made hers, and there is nothing more to be said about it. Now I come to Mrs. Woodcourt. How do you like her, my dear?" In answer to this question, which was oddly abrupt, I said I liked her very much, and thought she was more agreeable than she used to be. "I think so too," said my guardian. "Less pedigree, not so much of Morganat, what's his name." "That was what I meant," I acknowledged, "though he was a very harmless person, even when we had more of him." "Still, upon the whole, he is as well in his native mountains," said my guardian. "I agree with you. Then, little woman, can I do better for a time than retain Mrs. Woodcourt here?" "No, and yet—" My guardian looked at me, waiting for what I had to say. I had nothing to say. At least I had nothing in my mind that I could say. I had an undefined impression that it might have been better if we had some other inmate, but I could hardly have explained why even to myself, or if to myself, certainly not to anybody else. "You see," said my guardian, "our neighbourhood is in Woodcourt's way, and he can come here to see her as often as he likes, which is agreeable to them both, and she is familiar to us and fond of you." Yes, that was undeniable. I had nothing to say against it. I could not have suggested a better arrangement, but it was not quite easy in my mind. Esther, Esther, why not? Esther, think. "It's a very good plan indeed, dear guardian, and we could not do better." "Are you sure, little woman?" "Quite sure. I had a moment's time to think since I had urged that duty on myself, and I was quite sure." "Good," said my guardian. "It shall be done. Carried unanimously." "Carried unanimously," I repeated, going on with my work. It was a cover for his book table I happened to be ornamenting. It had been laid by on the night preceding my sad journey, and never resumed. I showed it to him now, and he admired it highly. After I had explained the pattern to him, and all the great effects that were to come out by and by, I thought I would go back to our last theme. "You said, dear guardian, when we spoke of Mr. Woodcourt before Ada left us, that you thought he would give a long trial to another country. Have you been advising him since?" "Yes, little woman, pretty often." "Has he decided to do so?" "I rather think not." "Some other prospect has opened to him, perhaps," said I. "Why, yes, perhaps," returned my guardian, beginning his answer in a very deliberate manner. "About half a year hence or so, there is a medical attendant for the poor to be appointed at a certain place in Yorkshire. It is a thriving place, pleasantly situated, streams and streets, town and country, mill and moor, and seems to present an opening for such a man. I mean a man whose hopes and aims may sometimes lie, as most men's do, I dare say, above the ordinary level, but to whom the ordinary level will be high enough after all, if it should prove to be a way of usefulness and good service leading to no other. All generous spirits are ambitious, I suppose, but the ambition that calmly trusts itself to such a road, instead of spasmodically trying to fly over it, is of the kind I care for. It is Woodcourt's kind." "And will he get this appointment?" I asked. "Why, little woman," returned my guardian, smiling, "not being an oracle, I cannot confidently say, but I think so. His reputation stands very high. There were people from that part of the country in the shipwreck, and, strange to say, I believe the best man has the best chance. You may not suppose it to be a fine endowment. It is very, very commonplace affair, my dear, an appointment to a great amount of work and a small amount of pay, but better things will gather about it, it may be fairly hoped. The poor of that place will have reason to bless the choice if it falls on Mr. Woodcourt, guardian." "You are right, little woman, that I am sure they will." We said no more about it, nor did he say a word about the future of Bleak House, but it was the first time I had taken my seat at his side in my mourning dress, and that accounted for it, I considered. I now began to visit my dear girl every day in the dull dark corner where she lived. The morning was my usual time, but whenever I found out I had an hour or two to spare, I put on my bonnet and bustled off to Chancery Lane. They were both so glad to see me at all hours, and used to brighten up so when they heard me opening the door and coming in. Being quite at home, I never knocked, that I had no fear of becoming troublesome just yet. On these occasions I frequently found Richard absent. At other times he would be writing or reading papers in the cause at that table of his, so covered with papers, which was never disturbed. Sometimes I would come upon him lingering at the door of Mr. Vole's office. Sometimes I would meet him in the neighbourhood, lounging about and biting his nails. I often met him wandering in Lincoln's Inn, near the place where I had first seen him. Oh, how different, how different! That the money Ada brought him was melting away with the candles I used to see burning after dark in Mr. Vaux's office, I knew very well. It was not a large amount in the beginning. He had married in debt, and I could not fail to understand by this time what was meant by Mr. Vaux's shoulder being at the wheel. I still heard it was. My dear made the best of housekeepers, and tried hard to save, but I knew that they were getting poorer and poorer every day. She shone in the miserable corner like a beautiful star. She adorned and graced it so that it became another place, paler than she had been at home, and a little quieter than I had thought natural when she was yet so cheerful and hopeful. Her face was so unshadowed that I half believed she was blinded by her love for Richard to his ruinous career. I went one day to dine with them. While I was under this impression, as I turned into Symonds Inn, I met little Miss Flite coming out. She had been to make a stately call upon the wards in Jarndyce, as she still called them, and had derived the highest gratification from that ceremony. Ada had already told me that she called every Monday at 5 o'clock, with one little extra white bow in her bonnet, which never appeared there at any other time, and with her largest reticule of documents on her arm. "My dear," she began, "so delighted. How do you do? So glad to see you. Are you going to visit our interesting Jarndyce wards? To be sure. Our beauty is at home, my dear, and will be charmed to see you." "Then Richard is not come in yet," said I. "I am glad of that, for I was afraid of being a little late." "No, he has not come in yet," returned Miss Flite. "He has had a long day in court. I left him there with Vaux's. You don't like Vaux's, I hope?" "Don't like Vaux's? Dangerous man!" "I'm afraid you see Richard oftener than ever now," said I. "My dearest," returned Miss Flite, "daily and hourly. You know what I told you of the attraction of the Chancellor's table? My dear, next to myself he is the most constant suitor in court. He begins quite to amuse our little party. Very friendly little party, are we not?" It was miserable to hear this from her poor mad lips, though it was no surprise. "In short, my valued friend," pursued Miss Flite, advancing her lips to my ear with an air of equal patronage and mystery, "I must tell you a secret. I have made him my executor, nominated, constituted, and appointed him in my will. Yes." "Indeed," said I. "Yes," repeated Miss Flite in her most genteel accents. "My executor, administrator, and assign. Our chancery phrase is, my love. I have reflected that if I should wear out, he would be able to watch that judgment, being so very regular in his attendance." It made me sigh to think of him. "I did at one time mean," said Miss Flite, echoing the sigh, "to nominate, constitute, and appoint poor Gridley. Also very regular, my charming girl. I assure you most exemplary. But he wore out, poor man, so I have appointed his successor. Don't mention it. This is in confidence." She carefully opened her little reticule away, and showed me a folded piece of paper inside as the appointment of which she spoke. "Another secret, my dear, I have added to my collection of birds." "Really, Miss Flite?" said I, knowing how it pleased her to have her confidence received with apparent interest. She nodded several times, and her face became overcast and gloomy. "Two more. I call them the wards in Jarndyce. They are caged up with all the others, with hope, joy, youth, peace, rest, life, dust, ashes, waste, want, ruin, despair, madness, death, cunning, folly, words, wigs, rags, sheepskin, plunder, precedent, jargon, gammon, and spinach." The poor soul kissed me with the most troubled look I had ever seen in her, and went her way. Her manner of running over the names of her birds, as if she were afraid of hearing them even from her own lips, quite chilled me. This was not a cheerful preparation for my visit, and I could have dispensed with the company of Mr. Vaux's, when Richard, who arrived within a minute or two after me, brought him to share our dinner. Although it was a very plain one, Ada and Richard were for some minutes both out of the room together, helping to get ready what we were to eat and drink. Mr. Vaux's took that opportunity of holding a little conversation in a low voice with me. He came to the window where I was sitting, and began upon Symonds Inn. "A dull place, Miss Summerson, for a life that is not an official one," said Mr. Vaux's, smearing the glass with his black glove to make it clearer for me. "There is not much to see here," said I. "No, nor to hear, miss," returned Mr. Vholes. "A little music does occasionally stray in, but we are not musical in the law, and soon eject it. I hope Mr. Jarndyce is as well as his friends could wish him." I thanked Mr. Vholes, and said he was quite well. "I have not the pleasure to be admitted among the number of his friends myself," said Mr. Vholes, "and I am aware that the gentlemen of our profession are sometimes regarded in such quarters with unfavourable eye. Our plain course, however, under good report and evil report, and all kinds of prejudice, we are the victims of prejudice, is to have everything openly carried on. How do you find Mr. C. looking, Miss Summerson?" "He looks very ill, dreadfully anxious." "Just so," said Mr. Vholes. He stood behind me with his long black figure reaching nearly to the ceiling of those low rooms, feeling the pimples on his face as if they were ornaments, and speaking inwardly and evenly, as though there were not a human passion or emotion in his nature. "Mr. Woodcourt is attendance upon Mr. C., I believe?" he resumed. "Mr. Woodcourt is his disinterested friend," I answered. "But I mean in a professional attendance, medical attendance." "That can do little for an unhappy mind," I said. "Just so," said Mr. Vholes. So slow, so eager, so bloodless and gaunt, I felt as if Richard were wasting away beneath the eyes of this adviser, and there was something of the vampire in him. "Miss Summerson," said Mr. Vholes, very slowly rubbing his gloved hands as if, to his cold sense of touch, they were much the same in a black kid or out of it. This was an ill-advised marriage of Mr. C.'s. I begged he would excuse me from discussing it. They had been engaged when they were both very young, I told him, a little indignantly, and when the prospect before them was much fairer and brighter, when Richard had not yielded himself to the unhappy influence which now darkened his life. "Just so," assented Mr. Vholes again. "Still, with a view to everything being openly carried on, I will, with your permission, Miss Summerson, observe to you that I consider it a very ill-advised marriage indeed. I owe the opinion not only to Mr. C.'s connections, against whom I should naturally wish to protect myself, but also to my own reputation, dear to myself as a professional man, aiming to keep respectable, dear to my 3 girls at home, for whom I am striving to realize some little independence, dear, I will even say, to my aged father, whom it is my privilege to support." "It would become a very different marriage, a much happier and better marriage, another marriage altogether, Mr. Vholes," said I, "if Richard were persuaded to turn his back on the fatal pursuit in which you are engaged with him." Mr. Vholes, with a noiseless cough, or rather gasp, into one of his black gloves, inclined his head, as if he did not wholly dispute even that. "Miss Summerson," he said, "it may be so, and I freely admit that the young lady who has taken Mr. C.'s name upon herself in so ill-advised a manner, you will, I am sure, not quarrel with me for throwing out that remark again, as a duty I owe to Mr. C.'s connections, is a highly genteel young lady. Business has prevented me from mixing much with general society in any but a professional character. Still, I trust I am competent to perceive that she is a highly genteel young lady. As to beauty, I am not a judge of that myself, and I never did give much attention to it from a boy, but I dare say that the young lady is quite eligible in that point of view. She is considered, so I have heard, among the clerks at the inn, and is a point more in their way than in mine in reference to Mr. C.'s pursuit of his interests." "Oh, his interests, Mr. Vholes!" "Pardon me," returned Mr. Vholes, going on in exactly the same inward and dispassionate manner. "Mr. C. takes certain interests under certain wills disputed in the suit. It is a term we use in reference to Mr. C.'s pursuit of his interests. I mentioned to you, Miss Summerson, the first time I had the pleasure of seeing you, in my desire that everything should be openly carried on. I used these words, for I happened afterwards to note them in my diary, which is producible at any time. I mentioned to you that Mr. C. had laid down the principle of watching his own interests, and that when a client of mine laid down a principle which was not of an immoral, that is to say, unlawful nature, it devolved upon me to carry it out. I have carried it out. I do carry it out. But I will not smooth things over to any connection of Mr. C.'s on any account. As open as I was to Mr. Jarndyce, I am to you. I regard it in the light of a professional duty to be so, though it can be charged to no one. I openly say, unpalatable as it may be, that I consider Mr. C.'s affairs in a very bad way, that I consider Mr. C. himself in a very bad way, and that I regard this as an exceedingly ill-advised marriage. I am here, sir. Yes, I thank you. I am here, Mr. C., and enjoying the pleasure of some agreeable conversation with Miss Summerson, for which I have to thank you very much, sir. He broke off thus in answer to Richard, who addressed him as he came into the room. By this time I too well understood Mr. Vholes' scrupulous way of saving himself and his respectability, not to feel that our worst fears did but keep pace with his client's progress. We sat down to dinner, and I had an opportunity of observing Richard anxiously. I was not disturbed by Mr. Vholes, who took off his gloves to dine, though he sat opposite me at the small table, for I doubt if, looking up at all, he once removed his eyes from his host's face. I found Richard thin, languid, slovenly in his dress, abstracted in his manner, forcing his spirits now and then, and at other intervals relapsing into a dull thoughtfulness. About his large bright eyes that used to be so merry, there was a wanness and a restlessness that changed them altogether. I cannot use the expression that he looked old. There is a ruin of youth which is not like age, and into such a ruin Richard's youth and youthful beauty had fallen away. He ate little and seemed indifferent to what it was, showed himself to be much more impatient than he used to be, and was quick, even with Ada. I thought at first that his old light-hearted manner was all gone, but it shone out of him sometimes, as I had occasionally known little momentary glimpses of my own old face to look out upon me from the glass. His laugh had not quite left him either, but it was like the echo of a joyful sound, and that is always sorrowful. Yet he was as glad as ever in his old affectionate way to have me there, and we talked of the old times pleasantly. These did not appear to be interesting to Mr. Vholes, though he occasionally made a gasp, which I believe was his smile. He rose shortly after dinner, and said that with the permission of the ladies he would retire to his office. "Always devoted to business, Vholes," cried Richard. "Yes, Mr. C.," he returned. "The interests of clients are never to be neglected, sir. They are paramount in the thoughts of a professional man like myself, who wishes to preserve a good name among his fellow practitioners and society at large. My denying myself the pleasure of the present agreeable conversation may not be wholly irrespective of your own interests, Mr. C." Richard expressed himself quite sure of that, and lighted Mr. Vholes out. On his return he told us more than once that Vholes was a good fellow, a safe fellow, a man who did what he pretended to do, a very good fellow indeed. He was so defiant about it that it struck me that he had begun to doubt Mr. Vholes. Then he threw himself on the sofa, tired out, and Ada and I put things to rights, for they had no other servant than the woman who attended to the chambers. My dear girl had a cottage piano there, and quietly sat down to sing some of Richard's favourites, the lamp being first removed into the next room, as he complained of its hurting his eyes. I sat between them at my dear girl's side, and felt very melancholy listening to her sweet voice. I think Richard did too. I think he darkened the room for that reason. She had been singing some time, rising between whiles to bend over him and speak to him, when Mr. Woodcourt came in. Then he sat down by Richard, and half playfully, half earnestly, quite naturally and easy, found out how he felt and where he'd been all day. Presently he proposed to accompany him in a short walk on one of the bridges, as it was a moonlight, airy night, and Richard readily consenting, they went out together. They left my dear girl still sitting at the piano, and me still sitting beside her. When they were gone out, I drew my arm round her waist. She put her left hand in mine. I was sitting on that side, but kept her right upon the keys, going over and over them without striking any note. "Esther, my dearest," she said, breaking silence, "Richard is never so well, and I am never so easy about him, as when he is with Alan Woodcourt. We have to thank you for that." I pointed out to my darling how this could scarcely be, because Mr. Woodcourt had come to her cousin John's house and had known us all there, and because he had always liked Richard, and Richard had always liked him, and so on and so forth. All true, said Ada, but that he is such a devoted friend to us we owe to you. I thought it best to let my dear girl have her way, and to say no more about it. So I said as much. I said it lightly, because I felt her trembling. Esther, my dearest, I want to be a good wife, a very good wife indeed. You shall teach me. I teach? I said no more, for I noticed that the hand was fluttering over the keys, and I knew that it was not I who ought to speak, that it was she who had something to say to me. When I married Richard, I was not insensible to what was before him. I had been perfectly happy for a long time with you. I had never known any trouble or anxiety, so loved and cared for. But I understood the danger he was in, dear Esther. I know, my darling. When we were married, I had some little hope that I might be able to convince him of his mistake, that he might come to regard it in a new way as my husband, and not pursue it, all the more desperately for my sake, as he does. But if I had not had hope, I would have married him just the same, Esther, just the same. In the momentary firmness of the hand that was never still, a firmness inspired by the utterance of these last words, and dying away with them, I saw the confirmation of her earnest tones. You are not to think, my dearest Esther, that I failed to see what you see and fear what you fear. No one can understand him better than I do. The greatest wisdom that ever lived in the world could scarcely know Richard better than my love does. She spoke so modestly and softly, and her trembling hand expressed such agitation as it moved to and fro upon the silent notes. My dear, dear girl! I see him at his worst every day. I watch him in his sleep. I know every change of his face. But when I married Richard, I was quite determined, Esther, if Heaven would help me, never to show him that I grieve for what he did, and so to make him more unhappy. I want him when he comes home to find no trouble in my face. I want him when he looks at me to see what he loved in me. I married him to do this, and this supports me. I felt her trembling more. I waited for what was yet to come, and I now thought I began to know what it was. And something else supports me, Esther. She stopped a minute, stopped speaking only. Her hand was still in motion. I look forward a little while, and I don't know what great aid may come to me. When Richard turns his eyes upon me, then there may be something lying on my breast more eloquent than I have been, with greater power than mine to show him his true course and win him back. Her hand stopped now. She clasped me in her arms, and I clasped her in mine. If that little creature should fail too, Esther, I still look forward. I look forward a long while, through years and years, and think that then, when I am growing old, when I am dead perhaps, the beautiful woman, his daughter, happily married, may be proud of him and a blessing to him, or that a generous, brave man, as handsome as he used to be, and as hopeful and far more happy, may walk in the sunshine with him, honouring his grey head and saying to himself, I thank God this is my father, ruined by a fatal inheritance and restored through me. Oh, my sweet girl, what a heart was that which beat so fast against me! These hopes uphold me, dear Esther, and I know they will, though sometimes even they depart from me before a dread that arises when I look at Richard. I tried to cheer my darling and ask her what it was. Sobbing and weeping, she replied, that he may not live to see his child.